To Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming, and I'm here with my co-host, friend and colleague, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What's up, Tim?
How are you doing, Brian?
I am doing very well, and in just a moment, we will be introducing the very first guest in Embargoed history. We're very excited to have this guest on today. As we teased last time, we weren't sure we could get him, but he's coming to us. He's coming to us live from his villa. We're going to introduce him in just a moment.
I mean,
before we do, though,
we're classing the thing up.
We are classing the thing up. You for those who are watching this on YouTube, please don't judge me and Tim. Neither of us ever claimed to be the best dressed man at Miller Chevalier, and this is only going to confirm that. In any event, thanks for everybody tuning in to the latest episode. Today, as we indicated last time, this is our China-stravaganza episode, which is timely because China, not surprisingly, is just in the news 24/7 these days, and so we have a lot of ground to cover today. There's going to be no lightning round today because we do have so much content. I know it's very sad for those who are fans of the sound and video effects, but just for a quick roadmap for anybody who's listening and may want to skip to particular sections, we're going to start with our very special guest joining us to talk about the U.S. China trade deal and the tariffs. Then we're going to pivot to the big new rule that was just rolled out by BIS last week regarding military end users and uses relating to China. And then we're going to bring it home with CFIUS and foreign direct investment and a bit of an enforcement roundup at the end focused on Huawei and a number of the DOJ China Initiative activities that have been going on the last couple months. So before we get into it, just a reminder to everybody, please, if you like the podcast, please give us a rating. You can check us out. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube, Google, anywhere you get your podcasts. We appreciate everyone's continued support and good wishes. And Tim, any final thoughts before? Oh, and the usual caveat: we're not giving anyone legal advice. These are our own opinions, and we're not sharing any confidential information. So. Tim, before we introduce our very special guest, any final thoughts before we get started here?
Just a couple quick thoughts. The first is, it should be pretty obvious that we're not providing legal advice. I think you could listen to us for like 30 seconds and know that nobody would ever rely on anything that we're saying on the podcast, as opposed to
on the podcast, as opposed to when we're doing our day jobs. And
absolutely,
have our lawyer hats on.
No. We can give legal advice when we want to, but this clearly is not it. The other thing is that, we hope many of you will subscribe to the podcasts on those various sites because, we really actually we now have listeners on 6 continents. We're missing Antarctica.
No Antarctica, but everywhere else, apparently, we've now confirmed we have listeners. So that's pretty cool.
There's lots of people who want to hear non-legal advice about embargoes, which is great, and about China trade.
And so, without further ado, let us introduce our very first guest. So we are very happy to be joined here today by our friend and colleague at Miller Chevalier, an expert in all things related to the U.S. China trade agreement and the tariffs. He lives and breathes this stuff day in, day out. Mr. Richard Mojica. What's up, Ricky?
Hey, guys. How you doing?
What's up, Richard?
How you guys doing?
We are good, and you are looking real good, and you're just luxuriating and living your best life.
Tan and well rested.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Well, thanks for making a little time to join us today. And as I said, I think we needed your expertise in our China deep dive here today to get into a little more granularity than Tim and I are able to on the trade deal and the tariffs. Because while we follow this stuff closely, this isn't our day in, day out counseling and activities, and it is yours. So to set us up, I think, for our first sort of portion of the conversation here, a lot has been in the news the last couple weeks, really since our last episode dropped 2 weeks ago, relating to the phase 1 of the U.S. China trade deal and meeting requirements and expectations, and the president has made some provocative statements that have gotten everybody in a tizzy, sort of running around speculating that we're about to scrap the deal or try to renegotiate the deal. There was a very heavily reported upon phone call that happened yesterday between a very high-level official in China and Secretary Mnuchin and I believe Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. trade rep. And the reports coming out of that are generally positive, but a little bit of a mixed bag. And then today, just before we hopped on, we saw the president again sort of grousing and casting doubt about the future of the trade deal. So I think we have a lot to cover, but let's just start there in terms of what do you make of sort of what's gone on recently in the public comments and the signals that are being passed back and forth between the U.S. and China on phase one and on just kind of the overall future of the trade deal?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that this has been a very, very hectic week for U.S. China trade relations, and what was reported this morning, and you just alluded to, is this conversation between top-level trade officials from the U.S. and China, and this is really, as far as I understand, the first conversation of this type since the trade deal closed in January. And what's interesting to me is that there are different readouts from the call. The U.S., and we've heard Lighthizer say this morning, USTR Lighthizer say this morning that as a result of the call, both companies have agreed to satisfy the expectations of phase one of the agreement. And what you hear from China is really a different tone. First you hear that you don't hear China say that they will keep up their purchasing promises, and instead they have a very carefully crafted statement, which I think is worth repeating, which is that they agreed to strengthen cooperation on the macro economy and public health, and to create favorable conditions for implementing phase one of the deal. So
that is an overwhelmingly
right.
positive message.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So let me see if I've got this straight. So I read the statements. You've got Mnuchin basically saying, "Oh, we have the greatest marriage, and it's going to be even better in the future." And then you've got China saying, "We're still working on things, but we're really hopeful that we can work stuff out." And then you've got the president in the background saying, "I don't even know that person."
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right, and it's not unusual in any given day in U.S. China politics these days. This seems to be a much needed call after a really terrible week where, starting on Sunday, the president went on TV and to kind of speak about the situation, and it's very clear that the relationship has deteriorated as a result of two main factors. One is, of course, the coronavirus and the fact that the U.S. administration blames China for its handling of the virus, and second, it's this kind of inevitable conclusion that China will not be able to buy as much as it promised as a result of the as promised in phase one of the U.S. China trade deal. And as a refresher, what happened there was China pledged to buy $200 billion worth of American farm, energy, and manufactured products and services over the next 2 years, and also address some of the U.S. complaints related to intellectual property concerns. But if we focus only on the purchase piece, the coronavirus has really made that almost impossible to fulfill, and so the U.S. is taking a very strong stance with China at the moment. And what we've heard from President Trump and the administration is that they are looking for ways to punish China for its handling of the coronavirus. But in addition to that, they are considering even withdrawing from the deal because if China does not satisfy its purchase commitments.
Well, let me ask this question. So with respect to the purchase commitments, and I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right, but it's more heavily weighted this year, right? Isn't it 100 and something million this year and like 70 or 80 million worth of purchases next year? Is that right?
I don't remember exactly whether there's how the numbers pan out between this year and next year, but you're
it's,
looking at,
yeah, there's some split. I can't recall exactly what the breakdown is, but in any event, regardless of what the number is this year, I mean, from all the economic indicators, just in terms of given the economic impact that the coronavirus is having in China, here, and elsewhere around the world, how real, if it feels like this is almost a doomed to fail kind of scenario, because China doesn't have the purchasing power to be keeping up its end of the bargain. And how is the U.S. side of this even going to work in terms of being able to produce the goods that are going to be needed to fulfill this?
Yeah, you're hitting on the right point. I mean, it goes both ways. Not only is China at a in a very difficult position in that it cannot buy the goods that it promised to buy, but also in part because of coronavirus related logistics, the U.S. cannot produce the goods that they need to sell to China so as to conform to the deal. So we're coming to a point where either it seems to me that the purchasing according to the targets is going to be almost impossible, and we may come to a point where the parties come together to renegotiate those targets.
Yeah, that was my question, Richard. I mean, so it seems like you have this kind of unforeseen event that postdates the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
You have these targets, you have a timeline. This
event,
event,
it postdates the agreement in certain parts of the world, but not in China.
Right. But as of the time of the agreement, nobody was thinking that the entire global economy was going to shut down in the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, what normally you would think that if both parties really wanted this deal, they would just kind of change some of the either the dates or the targets or both to accommodate the new circumstances. Has there been any talk about that?
Right. Yes. I mean, the agreement has a force majeure clause that they could tap on if the parties wanted to do so. It's a force majeure clause that in the event of an unforeseen circumstance, which we can I think agree is the situation here,
right,
then the parties can come together and renegotiate those targets. Whether that will happen, who knows? And as you know, the position right now, the U.S. position is that buy or we'll walk. So that who knows? But what is complicating this is that it appears that at the moment the U.S. is more interested in punishing China than in keeping the deal going. And in particular, the Trump administration has made comments to the effect of, we need to deal with the situation at home. Next, we're going to move to punish China. And there is no talk about a much anticipated phase 2 of the agreement. So, and in fact, we've heard people from the administration call, say that they're going to turbocharge this effort to that has started years ago, but has to continue during this time, which is to strip the China from strip the main supply chains that serve the U.S. out of China and move them to other countries. And the U.S. is exploring many tools to do that.
Yeah, and Tim and I are gonna cover some of those later on in the episode as we get into some of the export controls and other things that are going on right now. So, well, let me ask this question. So, it's always sort of struck me that this was a, I mean, this is just my impression. My impression was this was a deal the U.S. wanted more than China, and that they were, for political or other reasons, and so they sort of made it happen. And now, the political value of the deal is probably not what it was perceived to be when it was about to be entered into, because of the chaos that's come along due to the coronavirus. And so, in terms of what, and it also seems, as you alluded to, that one of the strategies here of the current administration is to beat up on China, relating on sort of all fronts for many different reasons, including the fact that they, either fell down on the job or willfully allowed the virus to sort of get out of China, if you believe certain perspectives on it. And they're now looking for sort of whatever levers they have to just inflict pain on China and sort of use them as a bit of a straw man or a sort of sacrificial lamb to sort of pin blame on here. And so, in terms of, so you alluded to bring more pain to China and more tariffs, scrapping the deal potentially. So if there were going to be more tariffs, if there was going to be another round, are we talking about broadening out the products that's going to hit? Are we in the industries? Are we talking about just, you know, raising the numbers? Are we talking about some combination of those two? What would that potentially look like at this point?
I think, I mean, first of all, we currently have tariffs on $370 billion worth of China origin goods. That covers almost, you know, close to, 90% of all goods that come from China. And some of the goods that don't are not subject to tariffs today are goods that the U.S. needs for medical purposes, including to fight the coronavirus. So I don't see a situation where I see two potential scenarios. One is the Trump administration could raise the percentage, the tariff rate. So move it. Currently, these punitive tariffs range from 7.5% to 25%. So there's room to go higher, of course, with any of the different tariff tranches. And the other area where they could still punish the U.S., I guess, punish China, is as a result of the China deal. There's a sliver of tariffs tariff codes that are not subject to these punitive tariffs. They're what's regarded as list 4B, and it covers a lot of consumer electronics, and as well as some textile and apparel products. So those are industries that if you wanted to expand the scope, you could to broaden the industries. That's somewhere you could go.
Yeah. So I think that's as you said, that's this is something that's going to bear close watching over the next few weeks and months as this continues to, the war of words and regulatory actions continues with respect to China. So two things I wanted to follow up on there. So one is you made a point of saying, right now the current emphasis of the U.S. administration is very much focused on punishing China. The flip side, obviously, is that there's lots of reports coming in the news kind of daily, weekly, about various U.S. companies and industries that are seeking tariff relief in the face of COVID because they are, like, many around the world are just struggling right now to keep the lights on and to stay afloat in the midst of a global economic crisis. So give a little overview there, just in terms of what types of relief are people talking about, and do you really see any prospect for meaningful relief to come on the U.S. side in terms of tariffs?
Sure. So I think on the tariff side, there's an ongoing opportunity for companies that import products that in some way are needed to address the COVID outbreak. So not only PPE, but products like lab equipment that are slightly distanced from the front line, but are still necessary to that effort. And so what the USTR did was open kind of an ad hoc, out of cycle exclusion process, and they are considering comments from companies that if successful would get tariff relief. Frankly, I looked before the podcast, and 245 or so companies have submitted exclusion requests to date, and my understanding is that USTR has not yet ruled on those. So there's still a month or so. The deadline to submit these exclusion requests is June 25th, so there's still some time, but we'll have to wait and see to see whether this is really going to turn into some actual relief. And in addition to that, there's as you know, there's an exclusion process available for the various tariff lists that have come through, and the USTR is still issuing exclusions on a somewhat regular basis. So and for companies that have received exclusions, which are generally 1 year long exclusions, there's an opportunity to renew those for years, for another year. So there is certainly still some, like a glimmer of hope, I would say, for companies, and something that I always tell everyone is that exclusions are product specific and not company specific. So something that we do pretty often is help companies look at these lists to see if any of the products that they import are on the lists, even if they had no part of requesting them, because that could mean significant relief.
So big picture, Richard.
Yeah.
In terms of the tariffs and the prospects for more punitive tariffs, have you seen anything to suggest whether that's really serious or not? You would think. I mean, tariffs have their purpose, but they are a lose-lose proposition economically. I mean, you inflict pain on China while at the same time you're inflicting pain on yourself. And when the economy is good, maybe there's some wiggle room to do that. But now, I mean, the idea of raising tariffs in a, I think the unemployment rate is now up to about 15%, seems like an idea that I think a lot of economists would question whether this is the right time to try that.
Absolutely. I think you're right, and there is just widespread opposition to more tariffs, and there's even criticism within the administration circles as to whether more tariffs at this point make any sense and would have any meaningful impact. I think that even though the tariffs are the president's weapon of choice, I think that there will be other ways to achieve similar objectives, and that big picture objective is to force companies to move their supply chains out of China. And so I think we will see national security probes. We'll see stricter export controls, and I know you guys are going to talk about that later. I think we may see legislation or executive action that could relate, for example, to curbing investment in China, perhaps tax incentives, maybe reshoring subsidies. And even the administration may play, a stronger role in U.S. procurement, requiring, for example, when it comes to medical devices, that a higher U.S. content or Buy America requirement, something like that. I think there are other tools in the toolkit beyond tariffs, given that, for the reasons you note, more tariffs would be incredibly unpopular at this point.
So I think the point you're making about the sort of decoupling from China of supply chains is one that Tim and I are certainly starting to see with respect to our clients, largely due to some of the new export control rules that have been put in place or that are being contemplated now, that we're going to talk about momentarily. One sort of final area that I'd love to hear from you on is, what have you been seeing so far from your clients or hearing in terms of what are people actually doing at this point? Because I think this is a big, obviously this is a massive expenditure. It's a massive undertaking if a multinational or a US-based multinational is going to endeavor to try to reorient and reroute their supply chain to avoid China. What have you been seeing so far in terms of steps that companies you're working with have been taking? Are they still in the planning phases? Are people really starting to make moves and execute and implement, or where do you kind of see things right now?
Sure, that's a great question. It really depends by this on the size and sophistication of the company. The bigger companies with the very complex supply chains have the luxury of being able to move around and make some very fast decisions as to what to do, and those bigger multinationals tend to have a phased or tiered approach where there is some movement out of China, but they're trying to keep a bit certainly in China, given the huge investment, and there's a fair amount of legal argument that goes into whether to stay or go. So companies are looking to see whether they can manufacture some in China and then have a processing step in another country, for example, such that the origin of the country of the product is not China, and they could benefit from not paying the tariffs upon importation to the United States. But that involves, that's generally the case when you have multinational with factories in places other than China. The companies that are solely in China, for example, that they have a contract manufacturer there, are in many ways stuck. And they're certainly, for some companies, we've helped them find and implement this change to another country, but that's not always the case. And I think that for the most part, companies are the smaller ones are just are finding a way to get out, and if they can, and the bigger ones are trying to diversify their supply.
All right. Yeah. So that's all fascinating, and it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. So before we let you go, we just any sort of final parting thoughts, any other sort of, whether about the trade deal, what's going to happen with sort of phase one, are we ever going to see a phase two?
And we would call this the Richard Mojica lightning round.
Yeah, exactly.
I got a jingle for that.
You're gonna get the jingle.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
maybe we'll have Matt throw in the little jingle. But so just any sort of final just things you're chewing over or sort of curious about how they're going to play out here.
I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with phase two. Actually, I haven't heard of any particular plan to move the deal forward, and so as it turns out, phase one is just all about China purchases. Which is interesting, because this is, if you follow the trade war from the beginning and you understand the reasons, or at least the stated reasons for implementing the tariffs, which really in many ways have to do with the Chinese industrial policies and concerns about intellectual property theft and protecting the rights of U.S. companies in China. You consider where we are right now, where as a result of years of negotiation, all we have are increased purchases, which are meant to lessen the trade gap, but nothing else. You really wonder what this is all about, right? You seem to have gone full circle in a way, and you just and in the meantime, U.S. companies have suffered quite a bit in paying all these tariffs.
Yeah, and I have to say, as somebody who used to prosecute IP theft and economic espionage coming out of China, just looking at the sort of the pledges that China made in phase one on the IP theft side, and Tim and I are going to talk about this a little later in context of the DOJ China Initiative. Right. I don't know that there's much there at the end of the day. I mean, there's they can make statements like the one they made after the call yesterday about how they're putting in place and looking for infrastructure to support these pledges, and what does that really mean? Is that really going to result in any change behavior? Is that
They've
really
been
going to
saying this since the Clinton administration?
I mean, that's exactly right. So I think to my mind, that's not a terribly meaningful get for the U.S. in terms of what China has pledged, and so we'll sort of see how it plays out. But
these tariffs really do have like really meaningful effect on companies. Companies have had to react to them, and to me, like at the end of the day, what I'm really looking forward to answer your question is how companies are what's going to happen, and whether there will really be a supply chain reorganization where companies actually pull out of China. Yeah. Because what we're hearing, from companies is like, well, it may not be today, but it may be tomorrow, where the administration continues to tighten the screws in China, and we really don't want to be involved, in the long term. So, and it's interesting, if you create an alliance or a counter that moves the supply chains away from China, you may recall that was in fact the purpose of the TPP. The idea was, let's create an alliance of countries. Let's give preferential treatment to trade among the countries so that we create a counterweight to China. And so, whether that was nixed by the Trump administration, but it seems, interestingly, that we're headed in the same direction, but through a different vehicle.
And of course, if as we sit here today, we're recording this on May 8th. We're 6 months away from the presidential election in the U.S. If Biden were to prevail, a year from now, we may very well see some new version of the TPP that's being kind of stood back up, because that was a centerpiece of Obama-era trade policy, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing to think about, though, is that if you called it something different, you could almost, sell it to the Trump administration, right? I mean, it's really kind of interesting, because I do think, and we'll probably talk about this on a different episode, there's not that much light when you come right down to it between where Obama was on this and where Trump was on this, in the sense that I think Obama was concerned about a lot of these same things with China. He was, an advocate of the TPP, which did a lot of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do in terms of building an alternative to China. Yeah. And yet at the end of the day, if you ask the current president whether his trade policy bears any similarities to the Obama administration trade policy on China, I think you would get an emphatic no.
Yeah, and to end on that note, Tim, on that note, as you know, NAFTA was recently modernized, to use the administration's term, and now we have the USMCA. And certainly one of the ways that they modernized NAFTA was to take a lot of the progress that, a lot of these new concepts that had been developed through the TPP negotiations and drop them into this new infrastructure. So the administration did in fact do what you suggest. They repackaged it in a way where it served their interest.
It's all a branding exercise.
It's a branding
at the end of the day. Let's not kid ourselves. But in any event, all right. So with that, I think we're going to bid adieu to Mr. Richard Mojica, our very first guest in Embargoed History. This was great, Ricky. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick.
And have fun sipping some cold beverages on your veranda after you leave us today.
Maybe we'll join you by the pool later.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Take care, Richard.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
So thank you to Richard for joining us. That was a lot of fun. I think that bodes well for future guest spots on the podcast, after I think we did that semi-successfully the first time here. So with that, let's move to topic number 2 today, which is the new, the big new BIS rules that were issued just about 10 days ago. And I'm going to turn that over to Tim to
Right, we're staying right on the same theme. So one of the many restrictions on trade with China in terms of exports is based on a concern of, again, it's kind of the theme of technology appropriation by the Chinese government, but this is kind of a more unique concern in terms of military technology appropriation, and that has been a long-standing concern of the United States, dating back, again, to the Clinton administration. And one of the ways that the U.S. has, for a long time, enforced these sorts of, or tried to keep the Chinese military from gaining access to U.S. technology, was through a portion of the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR 744.21, that restricts certain products, certain U.S. origin products, from being used, or at least until recently, from military end uses when they're exported to China. So you can't send a U.S. good to China, or certain U.S. goods to China for military end use. That has been a long time restriction. And so if you're a company and you export to China and one of your products is on the list of products that can't be exported to China for military end use, you have to make sure that your product is not being used in particular ways that could help the Chinese military.
Or you have to go try to get a license.
Or you can get a license.
Yeah.
You can get a license, because this is it's not a prohibition, it's a license. And in fact, currently and until June 29th, you could get a license. So it was, or you
Well,
there was a
theoretically, you could get a license until June 29th. I can't imagine
right.
too many are going to be issued, but yeah.
Right. No, and especially now, but the licensing standard was case by case, meaning that,
Yes.
you know, you could go in and if you could show them that you had a good case for a license, you could get a license. And that regulation actually also contained restrictions on sending any items, so or put any items on the list to the Russian and Venezuelan military, so they would call military end users, but it didn't contain that restriction on China. So as long as the product was something that as long as the Chinese military wasn't going to use the product for a military end use, that is in connection with a military product, with a gun or with a fighter plane or something like that, you could even U.S. companies could even sell to Chinese military end users. Now, as a practical matter, I'm not sure that that gap was all that important, mostly because for the most part, there would be a presumption that if you're selling to the Chinese military as the end user, that there was going to be a military end use for the product. And so I'm not sure how many sales went directly to the Chinese military, but recently, in the last 2 weeks, what the U.S. has done in response to some provisions in the Export Control Reform Act from last year, ECRA, they have tightened this rule and actually made this military end user restriction. So military end user is, you selling anything to the Chinese military, is now restricted. So you can still get a license and it still has to be a product that is on the list of products that's covered by this rule. But so that was one change. There's a military end user restriction, but the other change that is probably even bigger is that the list of products that are covered by this rule, the list of things you can't sell to China for a military end use or to a military end user, were greatly expanded. And so, previously those products had been pretty narrowly limited to some of the highest technology products, but there's this new list has now included, the one that goes into effect June 29th, now included products that are pretty lightly controlled from an export control standpoint. So only for anti-terrorism reasons. You're talking about mass market encryption software wasn't on the list, but now it's going on the list. You've got telecommunications testing equipment, a number of types of electronics, vibration testing equipment. And so there's all these new products that are added to the list, and there's restrictions now not only on sales for Chinese military end uses, but for use by the Chinese military. So that is kind of the sum and substance of the rule. And then I was just going
to chime in too, that the other related, so first of all, for anybody who hasn't read about this or isn't up on this, there's actually many facets to this. We're really focusing in on this aspect of it. So just to be clear, there are many facets of this. Right. There's a license exception that's gone away. There's one that's likely going away through a proposed rule.
It's complicated, but that's kind of the gist.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add to highlight is just that not only everything Tim just said about military end users and the list of products, but the definition of military end use itself has now been broadened, and that is significant as well. And in particular, it's significant in the way that the broadened definition of military end use that is now in the EAR, coupled with the broadened list of products. And coupled with the fact that now military end users are covered in China and have these restrictions upon them, those things together is kind of the area that we want to focus on today, because as I said, there's 20 different things we could talk about here. So just to be clear, we're not trying to cover the waterfront, but these new rules with respect to military end users and end uses in China, I think that interplay is really what's most interesting. And Tim, and so to throw it back to you for a second, Tim. So what, explain to everybody sort of with the existing definition of military end user, which BIS has been very clear in the Federal Register notice. They were very clear. They were not amending the definition of military end user. They were now making it applicable in China, but they were not amending that definition. And they were putting new requirements on exports to military end users in China, but not amending. However, there's some legacy language in there that we've been referring to as sort of a catch-all provision that's pretty broad in terms of how you could construe military end user. And then when you add that to the broadened definition of military end use, and you add that to the new, much expanded list of products that are now going to be caught here, what are we thinking about there, and where do we think this is maybe heading, and how is this all going to get cleared up? Because to sum up, it's a little murky, it's a little vague. I think there's a broad reading and a narrow reading of how this all works, and we have our views on how that works, but it's unclear where the Commerce Department's going to come down on this.
Right. So part of the problem here is that this provision, and this is why I mentioned it in the intro to this segment, this provision currently only applies to sales to military end users in Russia and Venezuela. And right now, there's not a whole lot of trade with Venezuela, and there's not very much trade with Russia, since both countries are under some sort of economic sanctions, and they're not just traditionally, particularly Russia is not a big trade partner of the U.S. And so there has been this military end user restriction, but it didn't apply to China, and so it wasn't that big a deal. But now it's gonna apply to China, and so military end user. When I was talking about it before, I said, well, the Chinese army. So but really the definition tries to define, well, who is the Chinese army that we're talking about? And some parts of the definition are pretty easy, right? So they actually say the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and then they talk about the National Police. They talk about government intelligence and reconnaissance organizations. Still pretty good. I mean, you can tell that those are governmental organizations. You kind of know who you're looking at in terms of who the end user is. But the real issue that we've been focusing on, we put out an alert on this a couple weeks ago, is okay. So that's the Chinese military end user. But there's this catch-all phrase that says any person or entity whose actions or functions are intended to support military end uses as defined in Section F of the section. And as you mentioned, Brian, Section F of military end uses is now going to get broader. But if you read this, if you took a really broad reading of this, you could almost read it to say, well, any organization that engages in a now much more broadly defined military end use, or whose actions and functions are designed to support a military end use, then you could include all of those within the Chinese military. Well, the problem with that is that there's all these, at least seemingly non-governmental research institutions, universities in China that do civilian projects. And so you can, they certainly could sell to U.S. companies, and you could reasonably believe that those sales were not for a military end use. But if those research institutions do completely unrelated projects for the Chinese military, which some of them do, probably most of them do, even if it's only 10% of their business, are they now part of the Chinese military because they have engaged, they're an entity whose functions or actions are intended to support military end uses? And I think, there's a lot of reasons why I think the answer is no, because when you give a list of things that are the Chinese military, and then you're trying to include a research institute in that, it doesn't seem to fit. And you can parse the language of this to make arguments as to why it doesn't fit. So I think, a much better read of that rule is that, military means a governmental institution that engages in military policing type functions. But that's not what the language says. So you really have to do some work to get there.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to that is, that's not even mentioning beyond academic institutions and research institutions, just companies, right?
Yeah.
Just private companies, private companies. As as everyone knows, I think there's obviously some blurriness in the way that Chinese, what's a state-owned, what's an SOE in China, what's a government-backed company, what's a private or entity that is receiving some support or doing some work for the Chinese government in some way. I mean, that would cover just about everybody in across the board in almost every industry, right? Where there's some kind of blurriness, and this whole, and again, going back to sort of first principles with respect to this rule, if the idea is to thwart civil military integration in China and the diversion of items that are purported to be for civil uses, but that are ending up in military hands or for military development projects or the like, then a broad reading of that is really broad. And if that is the case, again, remember, as Tim said at the outset, we are now under, when this goes into effect at the end of June, this is presumption of denial for any exports that would be going to military end users for military end uses under the new rules. And so if that is the case, there's been, I think somebody, I can't recall where I saw this written, but it was a day or two after the rule came out. Somebody was like, this could be game over for certain U.S. trade with China, because it's going to be impossible to get a license. And if we're under the broad reading, literally just about any entity in China that has any plausible connection to the government, which is, again, just about everybody, is potentially off the table. So that's I think the big bleep sort of takeaway from this, right? Is that really what this is meant to do?
I don't think it was meant to do that, but I do think that the unfortunate reality is that and the reason I say that is if you look at the guidance that came out with it, the description of what military end user means is pretty narrow. I mean, it just gives the list. It doesn't even mention the catch-all. And so I don't think they were trying, at least with the way they wrote it, to turn the Chinese military into every single business and company, to include every single business and company in China that's ever done a project with the Chinese military at any point in time whatsoever. I mean, I don't think they were trying to do that. And I think there are ways that, lawyers can construe regulations fairly within the law not to mean that. But they didn't think about it. I just don't think they thought about it, and it just hasn't come up much because Russia and Venezuela are so, they're not involved in trade. But this could be game over if you read it too broadly.
And to get into, to sort of bring this home, because we could keep talking about this point for a long time, I would say that a little bit of how the sausage is made is, our understanding is that this rule was something that was, and this goes back to what we talked about with Richard earlier in the episode, let's just inflict as much pain on China as possible.
Yep.
Okay. So this rule apparently has been kind of in the can for a long time. It was something that was cooked up. This is, again, I'm not trying to be a journalist here, but this is just from what we hear from our sources and friends and colleagues throughout DC. This rule was something that was in the can for quite some time. And from the top down, the mandate came down, I want more pain on China. And this was sort of at the ready, and it got rolled out, and there was no notice and comment, and it just got dropped on everybody. 2 weeks. I think when this airs, it'll be almost exactly 2 weeks since this came out, and so I think there are definitely different schools of thought as to how broad this is really supposed to be. Because if you take the broad reading, the pain is severe, and if you take the narrower reading that I think we believe is appropriate, it's perhaps not as much. Now, I think that also begs the question, and maybe this is where we'll end, is, so what should companies do about this at the moment, right? If there was no notice and comment period, so this is the rule, and we hear that there is guidance that's being worked on by the folks at the Commerce Department, but the way the rulemaking and guidance process works, even in sort of, more sort of serene times, is that everybody across the interagency gets to comment on that and weigh in. And now I would suspect that folks at DOD and other places are going to come in and maybe feel, let's the broad reading, like we don't want you to put out guidance that sort of gives much daylight here. And on the other side of that, you're going to have U.S. industries, in particular the semiconductor industry and many other high tech industries that are going to be, have already mobilized to try to advocate for a narrow reading of this, because again, the decoupling from China, moving supply chains out of China, maybe that's a long-term play, but trying to do that in 2 months is not realistic for most businesses, and so that's just not an option at the moment. And they're trying to sort of work the problem from inside the system. So, what are, I guess, your final thoughts, Tim, on sort of what should companies be thinking about and doing right now in the face of this rule that is potentially an existential threat to some?
Yeah, so a couple of final thoughts. So first, I have formally heard that BIS is working on guidance on this, and that they hope to have it soon. Informally, I've heard that exactly the sort of discussions that you're talking about are going on behind the scenes as to what that guidance will say. And so one of the things that I think could influence the way that that comes out is if people and companies will actually make themselves heard as to this could be game over. And here's why this could be game over, because you added all of these new products to the list, and then you have this theoretically, gigantic definition of Chinese military end user that includes not only the army that everybody assumed that it would include, but includes all sorts of companies that nobody would have ever guessed were, going to be read to mean that they were part of the army. And I think if companies would make themselves heard in terms of why that's such a bad idea for America, and why that's such a wrong-headed idea in terms of regulatory construction, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, and I should add as a very, very last point here that to the great credit of the good folks at BIS, they have shown over time, I think, a lot of openness to hearing that, to getting data and examples, and to being persuaded, and to needing more sort of fuel for the fire to sort of figure out how this can really be crafted in a way that's perhaps serving the punitive purpose on the one hand, but is not going to be destructive on the other hand to U.S. interests. So,
well, and remember, I mean, even if these companies are not military end users, you'll still need a license that will be presumptively denied to sell to any private company that is going to use your product for a military reason. And you've got a lot of due diligence that you have to do in order to make sure that they're not using it for any military reason. So it's still a pretty broad rule, even if it's what we're calling narrowly construed.
Right, and that also just brings up a lot of questions about how that gets administered, implemented, what kind of compliance steps you would need to take. And as we're sort of rooting through this and advising companies at the early stages of this, these are things we're wrestling with. So anyway, stay tuned. There's no doubt we will be coming back to this topic at some point in a future episode. But with that, we want to pivot away to another big China topic, which is foreign investment. And this is one that we have actually not really spent much time on to date on any prior episodes, even though it is an issue and an area where Tim and I do spend a lot of time. And that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS. And we could spend multiple episodes just talking about China CFIUS issues. We're not going to do that, because we're going to try not to make this a 4-hour podcast. But
sorry, Matt.
Yeah. But as we record late on a Friday, but
right.
The main thing we wanted to focus on is, and for those who, and just let me give just a quick 2-minute background primer on this for those who are not as familiar with CFIUS. So CFIUS is the collection of government agencies in DC that reviews foreign investment inbound to the US for national security concerns. The CFIUS, 2 years ago, there was a new law passed by Congress called the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which did exactly that. It sort of sought to modernize CFIUS and broaden its purview and its jurisdiction. And it took from that was signed into law in August of 2018, and just a few months ago, in February of this year, the regulations were finally put into place to fully implement CFIUS. So what we have now is, and I should add, FIRMA and the new regulations were largely driven, surprise, surprise, by U.S. concerns relating to China and Chinese investment in the U.S. and Chinese investment in the U.S. leading to the ability to steal valuable intellectual property and have access to sensitive personal data of U.S. persons and the like. And so that is largely what was motivating the new rules put in place for CFIUS. And in fact, early evidence is that, and sort of anecdotally from what we know from our work in this space, I think at the height of the Chinese investment trend in the U.S., which was I think the very last year of Obama into the first year of Trump, so 16, 17, there was something like 25 billion. I think it was $25 billion is the number I've seen in a recent study of Chinese investment in the U.S. And as of last year, it had dropped all the way down to 3 billion. So
I saw that number. It was shocking.
yeah, so there has been already a massive sort of curtailment of Chinese investment. So from the CFIUS investment security standpoint, it's kind of mission accomplished. And I should add also that the main contribution of FIRMA, again, we could do like 4 episodes on this, but the big thing is under old CFIUS, basically they were allowed to review M&A transactions and what are known as control transactions that would result of a foreign investor getting control of a U.S. business. Now, under the new rules and the new regulations, control is not necessary. Those are still in play, but there are non-controlling investments now that CFIUS can review in several areas, including critical technologies, critical infrastructure, sensitive personal data, and real estate. So that is in a nutshell kind of what the new CFIUS can cover. And like I said, that's a drastic oversimplification, but for our purposes, that's all we need for today. So the key thing and the key issue that we want to talk about now is, so Chinese investment way down. Okay, people, policymakers, people in government, happy, relatively happy. And we have the new rules in place and the new jurisdiction and the new tools, but now we have the COVID crisis. And we have a lot of people that are struggling, as we have been saying, to keep the lights on. We have startups who would normally be in the market for startup capital, venture capital, funding rounds to help them go from sort of phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 of their sort of growth trajectory and their plan. And that, again, anecdotally and what's being reported, these things, everything's been sort of turned on their head the last 2 months. And so what we've started to see is a kind of preemptive fear in the U.S. government, and in particular coming out of DOD, that there's going to be kind of opportunistic investment coming in from China, try sort of under the radar, perhaps not being notified to CFIUS, even though there are now some mandatory reporting requirements or filing requirements with respect to certain types of investment. They're still pretty narrow. And so only certain types of critical technologies and certain foreign investment-backed investments are mandated to be notified to CFIUS. Everything else is voluntary. And so the effort that we're seeing now and the discussion that we're seeing is somewhat proactive, is trying to what they have termed thwart adversarial capital, which is a term I don't think I have ever seen before.
Especially in a capitalist society, right?
I kind of like it, actually.
Right.
So hats off to whoever coined that phrase. But
I thought it was Bernie.
Yeah, it could have been. That would be ironic. But in any event, trying to get ahead of what would be known as adversarial capital, which is really just a shorthand for, we don't want opportunistic Chinese investors to come in and scoop up U.S. businesses or to fund U.S. businesses in a non-controlling manner in the wake of the destruction that COVID is creating. And, so we're trying to get the word out to get people aware of that. So I guess my question to you is, what do we make of that? What is, what are the prospects of success on that front? And how big a threat do we really think this is? A year from now, are we going to wake up and see numbers that suggest that there was actually a massive influx of Chinese investment in the second half of 2020 that never got, notified to CFIUS? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So last show, our theme was OFAC understands, and that was their response to the COVID crisis. And so if you were, doing your best, but there were extenuating circumstances, OFAC would be kinder and gentler in terms of its review. CFIUS does not understand, and I think that's kind of the opposite side of the scale, where they're saying to Chinese investment, don't try and take advantage now because we're paying extra special careful attention to any Chinese investment, especially Chinese investment of an adversarial nature. The government's pretty busy and pretty slowed down right now, so it might not be a real threat from CFIUS. But I do think that anytime you have such a huge economic downturn, the idea of turning down money, even if it's foreign money, it gets a lot harder. And so I do think that there certainly are going to be opportunities for investment from China and anywhere else that American companies are going to be desperate for at this point in time. And so I think that kind of adversarial capital, to the extent it's out there, this would be the right time to spend it. And whether CFIUS is going to be as diligent and active in trying to shut it down, we'll see. I mean, we haven't seen any signs of that other than just talk.
Yeah, I think this is right now. This is sort of a prospective issue, right? Because I think there's a lot of talk especially in the private equity world, the venture capital world, about how everybody's sort of keeping their powder dry to just inundate you with cliches at this point, and waiting for when the dust settles. There's another one, to sort of jump into the market and take advantage of what are going to presumably be some pretty serious buying opportunities or investment opportunities, whether it's late this year or first half of next year. And so one thing I'll say is, an interesting question is, two things, I guess. One is, we have seen a trend in recent years, and FIRMA and the regulations have put an emphasis on this and made this a point to sort of part of the sort of new and improved CFIUS, is this idea of looking back at prior concluded transactions and prior investments to potentially investigate them and unwind them if they are deemed to be national security threats. So I think for anybody out there who thinks that they might be able to sneak one in under the radar, perhaps that's the case, but perhaps not, because between the trade press and CFIUS's own resources, there is attention that gets paid to these things sort of eventually. Like how
Right.
soon that'll be, I don't know, and in what areas and what industries, it's hard to say. Some are pretty predictable, maybe some others less so, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. The other question I would put out there as kind of a bit of a hypothetical is, if you are especially if you are a sort of up and coming company that is sort of cash poor and in a development phase, and as we well know, compliance is not a high priority necessarily at that phase of your development. You're just trying to develop your idea and get to market, or you're working on the science, you're working on the product development. That's your primary focus. And if you came upon an opportunity to get some investment from a Chinese investor, or a fund, or somebody that had some Chinese investors behind it somewhere in the structure, how risk averse are you, versus how much are you just focused on, well, I need to fund my operations for the next 6 months or a year, and I'll worry about this later if somebody were to come and ask me about it, if the U.S. government were to come and ask me about it. So I think how do you analyze that? What is a risk that's big enough that you might want to think about stop pumping the brakes, as opposed to just perhaps accepting the money? Where are those lines drawn? For every company, it's going to be a little different, depending on the industry, depending on the where you are in your life cycle, all those things. So again, just sort of, I don't think these things have clear answers. This is just really more kind of putting this on the radar, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about this in the next 6 months.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing is that FIRMA gives CFIUS a lot of tools to crack down on this if it wants to back up its tough talk. And people are paying a lot of attention to China. It's looking like it's going to be a big issue in the 2020 election. And so I think that while there will be temptation to take this money, I'll be curious to see if companies really do, because it carries a lot of risk.
Yeah, and again, every case will be different, and quite frankly, part of the exercise here, as we know, is that for the smaller companies, there's just sort of getting the word out about what CFIUS is and what risks you may have in that area is still a work in progress in some parts of the country and in some industries. So, Silicon Valley, people who are tied in the Valley, New York, DC, they may be pretty well schooled on this stuff, but there are plenty of not always, as we know from our own experiences, but also in other pockets of the country where there's a lot of interesting especially on the tech side of things. A lot of interesting stuff going on and new ventures getting stood up. Not as much. So we'll see. But anyway, we did feel like we had to mention CFIUS and we had to mention foreign investment on our China-stravaganza. And with that, I think we're going to now head for home with the last sort of big topic, which is a bit of an enforcement roundup. And Tim is going to start with an entity and an issue that is near and dear to our hearts, and then we'll move on to some more IP and DOJ China Initiative issues.
What kind of China extravaganza would this be if we were not talking about Huawei?
It would be none at all. It would be a
Right.
sham.
And
Yes.
exactly, it would be worthless, and you could just delete it as soon as you downloaded it. So I'm going to try and do a Huawei lightning round, I think, because at an hour and whatever into this, we probably don't want to spend the next 2 hours talking about Huawei. But there's been a number of developments, as we could probably say that on every podcast. There've been a number of developments relating to Huawei, and it would always be true. So we've talked before, and we've heard that there are potentially harsher entity lists coming, entity list conditions coming. So Huawei was put on the entity list back in, I believe it was August of last year, and there are rules that generally apply to entity list entities, but there's some perception that those rules haven't been hard enough on Huawei. The main one being that they're able to get foreign goods that have below a 25% level of U.S. origin technology, and that are not the direct product of U.S. technology. And so the rumor has been for a while, and it's been more than a rumor, it's been talked about officially, is that Huawei, that those rules with respect to de minimis and those rules with respect to direct products of U.S. technology would be lessened for Huawei. That is, that they would be tightened up in terms of making them more harsh, and the numbers, the amount of U.S. technology that could be included within a good that ultimately found its way to Huawei would be a lot lower. Maybe those are coming, maybe they're not. I mean, we just keep hearing back and forth that they're just about here, and then they're not. And there was at one point where they were done, and then they were vetoed by the Defense Department. At least that was what was reported. And so I think that at some point there is going to be a crackdown on those rules, or at least the threat is going to be there for a long time. But as in terms of solid information, it's still something that's out there, but hasn't happened yet.
I would add one other thing that was reported recently is that perhaps they've now got a plan B in terms of cracking down on Huawei, which it was reported. I think I read this in Politico that that the plan B is to crack down on the foundries that Huawei that supply product to Huawei in terms of semiconductors. And so if BIS felt that they could sort of put the squeeze on them, then that may be a slightly less direct, but perhaps equally as painful way that they could inflict some more harm on Huawei. So that at least is also apparently in play and is being considered. So again, we don't know what's coming on that, but stay tuned, because the other thing that goes along with that is that if that were to come to pass, either of those things, we have certainly heard and that there would be retaliation from the Chinese. So that would probably put U.S. companies in the crosshairs that have big presence in China, and who knows what that would mean and how that would play out. So that's a domino effect that could really be pretty significant and pretty major if that's how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be out there a while, or it's going to happen, one or the other. I don't think they're going to withdraw that threat. So another thing that has happened since Huawei went onto the entity list is that right at the time they went onto the entity list, BIS gave some guidance because a lot of U.S. companies were asking, okay, so now that Huawei is on the entity list, can we participate in these these committees that formulate 5G standards, because generally when you come up with a new technology, industry plays a role, and it's usually multinational committees that play a role in figuring out, well, what are the standards going to be for 5G so that you can take your phone from one country to the next and basically get continuous service. And so Huawei was on a bunch of these committees, U.S. companies were on a bunch of these committees, and a bunch of the U.S. companies went into BIS and said, well, now that we can't provide any U.S. origin technology to Huawei, can we sit on a committee with them, one of these standards committees? And BIS gave some 2 pages of kind of, well, if you can't transfer any technology to Huawei, so certainly if you are in a public meeting, then that will be fine. But if it's a private meeting, don't transfer any technology. All bets are off is basically the way that they phrased it. And so you've got U.S. companies kind of left in the lurch, and at least there's a suggestion that unless the meetings are held in public, that U.S. companies really couldn't participate. And that was the message that U.S. companies received. And so U.S. companies started dropping off these standard setting committees to the point that, I guess the expectation was that if U.S. companies dropped off, the committees would just stop their work, but they didn't. They kept going. And so the standards are still being set. The U.S. just didn't have a seat at the table. And so it was reported earlier this week that BIS is planning to clarify its guidance to permit U.S. companies to come back to the table and start participating in these standard setting committees again, which I think is a good development, because I think it was relatively unrealistic to think that these committees are going to meet in public, which creates all sorts of issues and certainly chills debate in a way that you're going to want a bunch of engineers sitting at the table talking about standards to be able to say things without having them reported in the papers the next day. Or certainly if that's the consequence, they're not going to say nearly as much as they might say otherwise. So good development, and so it goes against our theme of tightening things against Huawei, although I think that was a situation where BIS kind of gave some guidance. I think maybe it hoped that U.S. companies would read it to allow them to participate, but that was not how they read it.
And I think the other piece of this is that it was seen, and I know that there was noise coming from Capitol Hill on this and some other parts of DC, that the U.S. was essentially it was abdicating its leadership role in 5G standard setting by virtue of this, and that was giving Huawei an outsized role and influence in this process. And of course, nobody in the U.S. government wants that. So this is, I think, an effort to get everybody squared away so that U.S. interests are going to be properly protected, and it'll signal that they can fully participate without fear of violating U.S. law. So this one seems like kind of a no-brainer, and this should be, I think, probably done, it seems like, in the next few weeks, but
let's hope. This guidance is a lot easier to write than that military end user guidance that we were talking about before. So and likely to be less controversial internally and externally. So hopefully it'll come fast. So Huawei also is the subject of a criminal prosecution in the Eastern District of New York, brought by your old office in combination with MR's, which has actually one of the lead attorneys there was one of our old partners, Laura Billings. So it is a familiar prosecution team, and in February Huawei was already under indictment for a number of charges, as was its CFO. I mean, this whole thing came to light when she was arrested in Canada on an arrest warrant that came out of these proceedings. And so that, but the original charges were basically sanctions evasion and money laundering. The new indictment contains a racketeering count, so they've really amped up the stakes. And as part of that, they are now, the criminal case against Huawei is moving, the extradition of the CFO of Meng Wanzhou is sitting in Canada, and as I understand it, it's going to sit there for a while because they had a schedule in which they litigated dual criminality in January. They were scheduled to limit. There's apparently a question about whether or not her cell phone and passwords were unlawfully seized, and then the evidence from that was provided to the U.S. and that's apparently going to be the focus of some hearings coming up. And then in September, they're going to talk about the sufficiency of the evidence if they get that far. And so that's on a slow track, it appears, or at least a relatively slow track. The criminal case is moving, and Huawei is getting discovery. And so last week, the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's Office went in and they're trying to get a protective order that would prohibit Huawei from sharing any of the discovery with Meng Wanzhou for use in the extradition case. Now, whether or not that is going to be a successful maneuver, it might be, because U.S. courts are very restrictive on criminal discovery in ways that consistently astound me, but it does seem kind of unfair that, if you're going to give it to Huawei, that somebody also facing similar arguments up in Canada wouldn't be able to at least see it. But that is pending at this point.
Yeah, one last quick point on the criminal case up in Brooklyn is when the indictment was superseded in February, there were also trade secret theft charges added, right, which is that is going to be the sort of final thing we're going to talk about here after we make one more Huawei point is that push on IP theft and trade secret protection pursuant to the DOJ China Initiative. So interesting to see that, and if anybody has seen the press release or the indictment, there's quite a bit of ink spilled on the lengths that Huawei has allegedly gone to over the years to steal U.S. trade secrets. So that's, again, interesting that the DOJ is going to use that as an opportunity to focus on that issue, and also it sort of plays into the broader theme and the broader strategy to try to inflict some pain on China in that area.
Well, I mean, in that case is growing and growing and growing. I mean, it's going to have the prosecution team looked very large. I was trying to
25.
Count.
It's like 25 names or something. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Big. So the final Huawei related issue is actually one that has, it's at the end of our list, and it has flown under the radar, but it actually could turn out to be the biggest issue of any of these. So back in the FY99 Defense Authorization Act, Section 889A1B contained a provision that said that anyone that does business with the U.S. government has to certify that they are not using Huawei and a number of other Chinese technology companies' parts in its operations, not in relation to the U.S. government contract that it is working on, but just generally that it's not using Huawei products. And so, there are a lot of government contractors out there doing business with the U.S. government, and Huawei products, Chinese technology products generally, are a big part of the U.S. economy. And so coming up in August, contractors are going to start needing to figure out, well, they should be trying to figure it out now, but they're going to have to start certifying in August whether or not they're using Huawei products, and if they are, they're not going to be eligible for government contracts. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, this is a little bit. This is really more. I think this is very squarely on the radar of government contracts professionals, and maybe in the trade world, this is something that's. There's a reason we're putting it forth, because it's sort of not the thing we think about every day, but it does raise a couple of fascinating issues. One is supply chain issues, because to Tim's point, you could be a multinational that has Huawei gear in your systems in Asia or Europe, and you're also a U.S. government contractor. What do you do about that? How do you reconcile those things? Does that mean that you have to walk away from your U.S. government contracts? Do you have to rip out all your Huawei gear? Do you have to what do you do about that? So this is a potentially massive problem that I think from what we have heard from our colleagues who focus on government contracts every day, DOD is not sure yet. They're not sure. They admit the language is broad. I think much like with BIS, they are inviting industry to come in with, tell us how this is going to hurt you. Give us specific examples. Let us help let us help you, help us help you. If you give us more info, we can craft better guidance and do more for you. So it remains to be seen how that's all going to play out, but we are only 3+ months away from when that rule goes live. So that this is a very big deal, and something to certainly we may be coming back to.
Yeah, I mean, it's flown under the radar in the media. I agree with you that it hasn't flown under the radar for government contractors generally, and certainly for, some of the folks that we work with that do that extensively. They've been working on that and thinking about it a lot. But the one thing that I would say, in terms of timing, is it's sneaking up on us, and the ability to actually do these sorts of kind of assessments of your supply chain are a little bit impaired at this point, given the lockdowns and given where the U.S. economy and U.S. health situation is right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's gonna be very challenging for people to wrestle with this, I think, in the coming months. So, like I said, I think we'll be coming back to it in the future. So, with that, let me pivot to sort of the last part of our enforcement roundup, focused on China, which ties back to what we talked to Richard about at the outset, which is one of the big one big focus of the phase 1 of the U.S. China trade deal was IP protection, and related to that, or sort of one of the building blocks of that under this administration, was the so-called DOJ China Initiative that was rolled out back in beginning of November 2018. This is still when Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General, and so I'm going to quickly kind of tick through some recent activity that's connected to the DOJ China Initiative, because although it contains a number of different sort of line items that are areas of focus, the top 3 are IP theft and economic espionage, and surging resources and making sure cases and enforcement actions are prioritized in that area, trade secret theft cases, and focus on what are known as non-traditional collectors. And so for people who have never worked in intelligence before, non-traditional collectors means academics, researchers, college professors, students, graduate students, people who often have access to highly sensitive information by virtue of their vocations, but are not trained intelligence operatives. They are civilians, essentially, that are sometimes requested at the behest of foreign governments to provide information, sometimes steal information, steal technology, and bring it back to that country. So this has been a longstanding concern with respect to China, and those are the top 3 priorities listed in the DOJ China initiatives. And just in the past couple months, we have seen, just in February, there were 2 trade secret theft cases that where we saw sentencing, one in DC, one in Oklahoma, both that had sentences of the first one was about 16 months in DC, and then the other case was 2 years, and those related to those are in private industry, so people in private businesses that were involved in trade secret theft for the benefit of China, or with connections to China, I should say, for the benefit of, actually has specific connotations in this world, which can mean economic espionage. It's not technically, they were neither was charged as economic espionage. They're both trade secret theft cases. And so it's just interesting, because I can tell you that in the history of the Economic Espionage Act, which dates back to the mid-90s, there were, at the time I was at DOJ, I think at one point we were barely into double digits of cases that had ever been charged under the Economic Espionage Act. And trade secret theft is a little different, because it's a slightly easier standard, and less facts are necessary to prove those cases. But there has been, by virtue of the China Initiative, I think, a clear surging of resources and emphasis on these cases. So the fact that there were just a couple of these types of cases that came down within a couple of weeks of each other is also noteworthy. There's also sort of what I would regard as kind of the flagship prosecution under this, which is the Micron case. The indictment was unsealed in that case on the day that the DOJ China Initiative was announced. 2 defendants in that case. One is a Taiwanese company, United Microelectronics Corporation. The other is a Chinese state-owned enterprise Fujian Jinhua Integrated Circuit Company. And Micron is a US-based semiconductor company, and they were the victims of trade secret theft, and they brought a lawsuit to enforce their rights. The DOJ followed about a year later to bring this criminal prosecution. And that case is in San Jose, I believe, Northern District, California. It's filed now over a year and a half ago. Not too much has happened, in part because, as anybody who's ever done one of these cases or been involved in one of these cases knows, there's a lot of back and forth usually about protective orders and keeping information protected. As Tim alluded to in the Huawei case, there's, even in a case like that, there's a lot of steps that usually need to happen in terms of keeping information protected. And that there's been a lot of back and forth on that front in the early days of this case. But that is still chugging along, and I would expect will be for some time, for some number of years. So that's just sort of a quick snapshot of those types of kind of more traditional trade secret theft, economic espionage cases. And then on the non-traditional collector category, there's been a veritable avalanche of those cases that have come out where there's been significant action this year. In January, there was the Harvard chemistry professor that was charged in connection with being associated with what's known as the 1,000 Talents program. If you don't know what that is, it's a Chinese program that is basically designed to encourage and cultivate sort of academics, researchers, to go out into the world, not just the US, but all around the world, and sort of develop their talents, gather information and best practices, and then come back to China and use those talents and that information for the benefit of China. The way it is viewed largely by US law enforcement is that this is it's a systematized program by the Chinese government to encourage people to steal US intellectual property and bring it back to China. Now, we could debate what's the truth in terms of what the program is and what it really means, but where we have seen more cases and where US researchers and academics have gotten in trouble is they have failed to disclose connections and funding that they have received from either the 1,000 Talents program or other Chinese universities that are state controlled. And they have simultaneously been doing research for US government programs here in the States. And so that's where the Harvard professor got into trouble. There was a West Virginia University professor who actually pled guilty under sort of similar facts just in March. And then there was another professor who was down at the UT Knoxville in Tennessee. Again, similar facts where there was a NASA work being done, and also for a Beijing university. And so this is truly a new day on these types of cases, because these were not cases that we saw 5 years ago. And this is really a new development. And so I think the high level point really here is, again, to the academic research community, much like what Tim was talking about with respect to export controls and how this is impacting those folks in a new and different and much broader, harsher way than it ever has before. Similarly, in the US, there is a lot to be sort of worried about from a compliance standpoint in terms of intellectual property and export controlled materials that people have access to at these institutes, and the sort of cross-pollination of any kind of funding that's coming in to any of these people from China and also from US government agencies. That is kind of the sweet spot in the Venn diagram where DOJ is kind of going after people. And Tim and I, both being sort of criminal defense attorneys by training, if you're gonna sit down for an interview with the US government, don't lie to them. If you lie to them, you're gonna make it worse. And a lot of these cases sort of come down to that also. And so again, I think just worth highlighting that there's been a relative flurry of activity here in the first part of this year in these areas, and I think it's directly traceable largely to the China Initiative, which is again only about 18 months old, and I think there's going to be a lot more to come in these areas going forward. So I've droned on too long, but let me toss it over to Tim.
No, I mean, this is a big deal, and I think it's going to continue. I will note that, and maybe we'll put it in show notes. I was reading a good article in Politico from early April. The title of the article was "Inside DOJ's Nationwide Effort to Take on China. And so it does lay out a lot of the stuff that you just talked about, Brian, in some detail. And it really is a very large and nationwide focused effort in order to kind of combat China's what DOJ views as China's infiltration into U.S. universities and research labs. The reason that I was looking at this article, it actually wasn't in getting ready for this, but the reason I was looking at this article is that it had some quotes from DOJ and from U.S. Attorney's Office that said that this sort of push was not going to be affected at all by COVID. That is, and this was in April, so this was after a lot of the lockdowns had stopped or had started, and a lot of the courts had closed, and so the thinking, I think, was that all DOJ initiatives, or virtually all DOJ initiatives, were going to be affected by the coronavirus. But the quotes from the U.S. attorneys were saying that it had not only has the efforts not stopped, but that the coronavirus had not substantially hindered their ability to develop cases. And so, you get a quote that said it really hasn't slowed the progress of investigations or prosecutions. We've adapted to this model. It won't have a short-term or long-term impact on the China initiative. And so I know for that other areas, including in some sense export controls and sanctions, really have been affected by the coronavirus. And we talked about this at some length in an earlier episode. But this thing is so high priority that they're trying not to slow down during COVID. And while I'm a little skeptical that it won't affect them at all, it sounds like they're trying to push through this in a way that, a lot of criminal cases are just stalled.
Yeah, and just to tie this all up with 2 points related to some things we talked about earlier. Number one, again, phase 1 of the China-U.S. Trade deal featured these sort of IP-related, concessions or pledges by the Chinese. As this is not, this I think is evidencing, and not that we would think things would change overnight, but this is a longer-term issue and problem that is not going away by virtue of anything that's in the trade deal, just period, full stop. And so this is something that DOJ and the US government is going to continue to be focused on, and that anybody who has intersection with any of these issues or is in any of these fields needs to be aware of and needs to be thinking about, both from protecting your own interests and protecting your people.
And I also don't think it's going away as a priority. I mean,
right.
Regardless of what happens in the 2020 election, I think that a high-level DOJ priority is likely to be information theft from China.
I agree 100% with that. And then the last point is, much like with what we were talking about with respect to adversarial capital and opportunism by the Chinese and others perhaps to invest, to sort of get in while the getting is good when the U.S. is maybe knocked down or catching its breath coming back from COVID. I think there's probably a similar fear here that these non-traditional collectors and other people that are going to be inclined or maybe are being requested to perpetrate these types of information gathering efforts or IP theft or what have you are going to maybe be emboldened right now when the spotlight is on so many other things to try to get in while the getting is good. And so I do think that the enforcement, the message from the enforcers that we're not going away, this is staying a high priority, and don't think that we're not paying attention to this is probably one to be heeded, although we know, I'm sure, that there are probably going to be people trying to take advantage of the current climate to get their hands on information and to pass it along where they can. So I do think that we may see, I would not be surprised if there's another flurry of activity that comes out of sort of bad acts and things that are found out to have been going on during this period because people thought maybe they could get away with something.
Totally agree.
So with that, we have gone, I'm glad we cut out the lightning round because this would have been like a 7-hour podcast if we had kept it in, but
China is the world's biggest country, and so it deserved the world's longest podcast.
That is true. The China-stravaganza is now, at least this is the first China-stravaganza. I think we could very well be coming back for a round 2 or round 3 or more, but with that, we're going to wrap up. So thank you to everybody, as always, for listening. If you're again, if you like this one, if you like prior episodes, please subscribe to the pod. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Likely no special guest next time, and likely no sole focus on China next time. But please subscribe, give us a rating, and until then, stay safe, stay home, and stay well, and of course, stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.